Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. It's a unique pleasure for us to welcome Professor John Esposito from USA. Professor John is presently director of the Center for Muslim-Christian Relations in Washington, D.C. He is here on a short visit to attend a seminar sponsored jointly by the Islamic University and his center. Professor John is not an unknown person in Pakistan, not only here, but he is known all over the world. He is one of the few authorities in America who have taken time to study Islam, write on Islam, and take positions which reflect understanding of Muslims as well as understanding of issues from a Western perspective. In this seminar, we have a galaxy of lecturers and visitors. Among those, Professor Esposito is one of the most prominent persons. We are privileged to have him in our studios. We welcome him, and we like to hear from him about the objectives of this seminar.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. As I said today, this is my 25th anniversary. I came here 25 years ago. I think that the conference is a very important conference because what we're really looking at is the relationship of the Muslim world and the West, and looking at it from the perspective of how if Muslims viewed the West, how has the West viewed the Muslim world. It couldn't come at a better time or a worse time, depending on how you look at it. In the post-Cold War period, it seems to me that there has been a danger to look for an alternative threat. And so at times people speak of an Islamic threat or people talk of a clash of civilizations. I think what we have here in this conference is scholars, Muslim and non-Muslim, from the Muslim world and the West, coming together and entering into very closed, intense conversation. It's not a big open conference, but rather it's an opportunity for people to really talk to each other and to look at what is it that Muslims and Christians share in common. Why is it that we've had tension in the past? Why is there tension today? And how can we change that situation? What do we need to do? What are our roles as scholars and as believers?
So John, you just mentioned about Muslims and the West. You also mentioned about certain, should I say, fears that exist in the minds of many scholars and policymakers in the West. First of all, could you enlighten us on this polarity which we have created between Muslims and the West? Does it exist actually, or is it our projection? Do we have this polarity that there is a West and there are Muslims? Or is it not a matter of fact that while we categorize these two aspects, Muslims are there in the West, and West has also been interacting with them? How far it is justified to have this polarity?
Well, I think you're right. I think that we have come to talk about the Muslim world and the West. That reflected the past, where in effect we were talking about the more than 50 Muslim countries. But the reality today is that if Islam is the second largest religion in the world, in Europe and America it's also the second or third largest religion. So it's more correct to talk about Islam in the West, or the Muslims of the West, as well as to talk about the broader Muslim world. And I think that that's part of, again, what in many ways the conference also has to be concerned about. You know, how to really address this reality, but also how do we make people more aware of it? Because the more that people realize that Muslims are not out there, but that they're here in Europe and in America, that they are neighbors, or that I like to say, what people in the West have to realize is that Muslims are us. Muslims are as much a part of the West as Christians and Jews and others. If we can get that reality across to people, then I think relations can be, and understanding can be strengthened.
You have your center in a place which is capital city. You have been interacting with people all over the world. You have been hearing about a possible clash of civilization, which you mentioned a while ago. But the way you have just now explained to me, Muslims in the West, as they are part of the West, they are part of a human culture and civilization. But why Sam Huntington thought there is an imaginary threat of a Muslim Sino coalition filling the gap which existed, or in his view, which exists even today after the collapse of Marxism? Do you have any observation on that?
Yeah, Professor Huntington and I actually have spoken together or debated in Saudi Arabia, and in 3 weeks we'll be in Cyprus on the same issue. Is it a clash of civilization, or should we be talking about civilizational dialogue? I think Professor Huntington, like a lot of professionals during the Cold War period, his specialty in many ways was to study the other. It was, in fact, to look at what were the threats on the horizon. When communism passed, the natural instinct of that professional is to look for the next threat, the next possible threat, number one. Number two, I think that in many ways, Professor Huntington, like others, looked and saw there are a billion Muslims, and they represent the only global ideological alternative. Having underestimated the role of religion for many years, because he was also one of the fathers of modernization theory and believed that as countries became more modern, they would necessarily become more secular, I think he then tends to exaggerate or overestimate religion, and so it becomes a fear. That is the power of religion. And I think that that has made for difficulty. And I think the last factor is that Professor Huntington really never had any great exposure or expertise on the Muslim world. And so then when you don't know very much, a lot depends on who you happen to turn to. If you look at his article in Foreign Affairs, the only two people he quotes are Bernard Lewis and Akbar. A.J. Akbar, I think. And they're the only two people he quotes. In his book, he then takes time to read a lot of other people. But I think that creates a lot of conditions that led to, I think, this exaggerated concern.
Don't you think when we talk a lot about clash of civilization, we create an artificial sensitivity which is not there? On the other hand, perhaps in your book on Islamic threat, a myth or reality, when you concluded the book, you said very correctly, it's not a matter of clash, it's a matter of challenge. If I recall correctly, you have talked about Islam as a challenge, which means that it does offer some opportunities, some options, and it's up to individual to look into it, respond to it, and that's what we mean by challenge. When we talk a lot about clash of civilization, I feel that we sell the idea, we create an artificial situation. It may create suspense, but it does not serve the purpose of creating more understanding. Your center's name as understanding between Muslims and Christians, I think, reflects a different approach. That you want to have understanding and not a matter of just give and take, not a matter of challenging and then responding to it, but it's a matter of ongoing process. So don't you think if we stop talking about clash and consider how there can be cooperation, how there can be collaboration, how there can be mutuality and not otherness, then we can build a better society?
I think you're right. I mean, I think that, clearly there have been in the past, and there are today, and there will be in the future at times, points of conflict. But there are also many points of cooperation and even more opportunities for understanding and cooperation. And so it's a matter of what you emphasize. If you're just focusing on a conflict and a clash, then you run the danger of creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because if people get into a mentality where they presuppose there's going to be a clash, they'll contribute to one. And I think what our center, we have a phrase that we use, building bridges of understanding. And I think the purpose of the center is to do that by bringing Muslims and Christians together within the center as faculty, as visiting professors, as well as when we have programs. It's only in that kind of interchange which we are beginning to do here with our conference, that I think one can work towards the kind of civilizational dialogue rather than clash that is in the best interest of everybody.
John, don't you think when academicians discuss these issues, perhaps they are not like policymakers, and they have much more liberty in coming up with critical approaches? In your book, you have even criticized the United States of America for its alignment on one side or the other, because as a patriotic person you feel your country should have better relations with all people and not just siding with one group or the other. Academically, when we talk about fundamentalism, when we talk about terrorism, when we talk about something bad happening anywhere in the world, media flashes immediately an image of a Muslim as terrorist and not of someone who is cause of terror. If Muslims are persecuted in Bosnia-Herzegovina, in Kashmir, in Chechnya, anywhere, no one ever focuses on that, why they had to respond. But when they respond to a situation, suddenly it is said terrorism and barbarism. In your dealing with these issues, do you find a shift in the understanding of Western scholars and people of your generation about these issues?
I think that you do. I think that the way I describe the difference is that until a few years ago, there was one school of thought, one primary, overwhelming school of thought. Today, I would say it's very clear, certainly in the United States, and many people have said this, that there are two schools of thought. You know, there are those who still tend to approach Islam, and particularly Islamic activism, and say there are no moderates, as it were. There are no moderate Islamic activists. There are no moderate fundamentalists. Okay, and then there are others who say we have to distinguish between violent extremists who manipulate religion and the vast majority of Muslims and the vast majority of Islamic movements that, if given an opportunity, will operate within the system. I think that's a major change. I think the other major change is that in the last 20 years, and you know this from when we were in graduate school together, which is much longer than that, but at that time when we were in graduate school, most colleges and universities didn't teach Islam. Today, most colleges and universities have coverage of Islam in the Muslim world. The publications are there. Now, all of them aren't, from my point of view, wonderfully accurate, but many of them are. And so there's much more visibility. And the third factor is that there are many more Muslims visible. When I was growing up, you didn't see mosques even in major cities. Now there are many mosques. And the example I give of my own parents, both my parents have Muslim physicians. As it turns out, they both have Pakistani physicians. And the reason is that the community they live in has an increasing percentage of physicians from the Muslim world. So I think that all of this, you know, moves towards creating a different kind of situation, certainly a more diverse situation.
Don't you think if we change our overall approach of treating Muslims as others, we will be creating a better society in the West? Because as you mentioned a while ago, there are many Muslims, professionals, students, businessmen. Now even in the area of public sector, you find people there. Is it not better for us at this point to consider Muslims as part of this global culture? We are in an age of globalization, where you have economic resources, media resources, culture, everything going through globalization. So why shouldn't we project more about these aspects through our educational programs, through opportunities available on media, in order to create a new approach toward Muslims?
I absolutely agree. I think that, you know, the challenge that many in the West face is to see this kind of mutual presence But it's a two-way street. And I speak, as you know, to a lot of Muslim groups, and particularly at a lot of at mosques and fundraisers for building mosques. And what I often say is that the danger has been that too often we each have talked about the other. You know, we each know what the other has done to us. Muslims are very much aware of the Crusades and European colonialism, etc. And many Americans and Westerners think about the impact of the Iranian Revolution and hostages, etc. But it's in our interest to look at the broader picture. It's in our interest to build towards the future. And what that really means is getting to a point where we come to realize that we are all part of the global community, and that the danger is if we raise a next generation that thinks in terms of the other, us and them. Soon as you create the other, the danger is you can easily demonize the other. And that's why, for example, I think it's very important for us all to emphasize that we are children of Abraham. Yes, we have significant religious differences, sure, but as children of Abraham, we also share a good deal in terms of belief, values, family values, concerns about the impact of secularism. That needs to be emphasized. And unless we do that, then I think we will perpetuate a world in which there is this distancing, or what I call, at its worst, engaging in mutual Satanization. Each side denouncing the other as shaitan.
Very interesting term. By the way, in your writings, you quite often use the word Islamic activists. Perhaps it stands for those who belong to Islamic movements who call for a revival of Islam. But generally, activists are understood as people who are more easily motivated to violence. Do you find in your study of Islamic movements a correlationship between revivalism and violence, revivalism and anti-democratic approach, revivalism and an opposition to system as such? Or you feel that these two are compatible? Islamic movement could be very much for constitutionalism, for democracy, and Muslim activist does not have to be a person who always carries a dagger or Kalashnikov in his hand and runs on the other person.
I think that's true. In fact, John Vole and I, John Vole's a colleague of mine, published a book a year ago called Islam and Democracy. And what we argue is not that Muslims must accept democracy. What we simply talk about is that there are many forms of political participation, and that Islam is certainly compatible with those forms, and that therefore states as well as Islamic movements, that there's a compatibility. The distinction that we draw, though, is we say there are a minority of activists who are extremists, and we have that among secular activists as much as you can have religious activists, but that the majority of Islamic movements that we've studied and that we know, if given the opportunity, function within the system. Where violence occurs there is when the state is repressive, as in Algeria. When the state creates conditions of violence, then the risk you run is that people in self-defense will become more violent, and that you will encourage conditions that will breed even greater forms of radicalization and violence.
So what you are saying is, even in Algiers, it is a result of violence on the part of a state that the Islamic groups, activists, Islamic movement had to take a comparatively violent position. In your encounters with the people who are known globally, Hassan Torabi, Rashid Ghannoshi, Khurshid Ahmad, many others, you were the one who invited them to a number of seminars and conferences for Christian-Muslim dialogue. Do you find their ideas are really so horrifying, so much violent, that they would be painted as people who are against the West, against Western civilization culture? Or you find that they have a dialogue at a level of equality? They just want to interact with dignity and honor, or how you look at the issue?
I would say that a significant number of Islamic activists and intellectuals that I've known over the years, such as the people that you mentioned, and people like Mr. Erbakan and Anwar Ibrahim in Malaysia and many others, if you look at at their thought. You see that for most, they are clearly people who talk about working within the system, who, yes, are critical of the West, just as the West will be critical of the excesses that it sees in the Muslim world, but who are not violent revolutionaries. The only concern that I've had in recent years is the role of Hassan Tarabi, who's an old friend of mine, in the Sudan, and some of the events that have occurred in the Sudan. I think some of what's gone on there has contradicted a good deal of what he has been standing for. But with regard to Khurshid Ahmad, with regard to most of the other Islamic activists that I've known who have for years presented a mainstream image, the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood of Jordan, they have continued, A, to hold that image, and B, I would say if you read most of them, they have grown in their thought, they have developed their thought, they have attempted increasingly to engage the West as well as to be self-critical. And I think that's their accomplishment.
Then why do you think when a media coverage is made about Muslims, Islamic movements and activists are always flashed as people who just want to smash America, Europe, Western culture? Why this image is created?
I think that, first of all, the American experience of Islam in the Muslim world came through the hostage-taking in Iran and hostage-taking in Lebanon. There was no background, so people generalized from that, number one. Number two, the media globally, and certainly the media in the West, is headline-driven. It covers headline events. The most important thing for the media is selling newspapers, is getting lots of viewers for TV shows and radio shows. So what you do is you don't look at the normal everyday activities, but it's the disasters. You know, the media has great plane crashes, great train, and so these major violent disasters are what's going to sell newspapers. That's what make people pick things up. And so they tend to focus on the headline events that represent a minority, and that gets in the way and winds up leading to a generalization about the majority of movements. I think the other thing is, to be very frank, that there are Western policymakers and there are policymakers in the Muslim world and in Israel for whom talking about an activist threat legitimates not looking at the problems in their own country, blaming their problems on a group within the country, and legitimates the violation of the human rights of many groups or of not opening up the political system. And so this leads to a complicated situation.
Sure. Thank you very much, John. I think we had an extremely enlightening discussion, very crisp comments, and ideas which are a result of long thinking process that John has been going on. We thank you very much. It's a pleasure for us to welcome you in Pakistan and hear from your observations on how we can bring Muslims and Christians together. Not only that, but Muslims and human beings together. Thank you again.
Thank you.
अच्छा our producer is saying he is Prophet, peace be upon him. So he's saying the interview is over now, but can we have just a few questions on the life of Prophet? Then he can use that as insert in some other program.
Sure.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Professor John, it's a pleasure to have you in Pakistan. We heard a lot about the Western approach toward the Prophet. Hardly there is a discussion that takes place in the West where, either in writing or verbally, you will not find a live debate on aspects of his life. Historical questions are raised, psychological feelings are explored. At the same time, we find in social context some issues are raised. Some people think that the main issue between Muslims and Christians is Christian perception of the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, and Muslim desire to defend him and present and project his personality properly. In your academic studies and research, do you find a shift in the academic climate in the West regarding the perception of Holy Prophet, his personal life, his public life, his economic teachings, or you think it's an ongoing confusion in the academic circles?
I think that a very interesting thing has happened in something like 30 years that I've been studying Islam. The shift I would describe in the following way. On the one hand, there's a small school of thought among primarily, I would say, Western non-Muslim scholars, but also some scholars who come from the Muslim world, to become more skeptical, more critical on historical questions, for example. But on the other hand, I think that as there's been a greater understanding of Islam, as we've moved beyond Orientalism, it's not that there aren't what I call neo-Orientalists, but I also think that we now have a generation of scholars, Muslim but also non-Muslim, who I think many would say understand Islam and from within, as it were. I think that we see a much more realistic and constructive approach to the Prophet. It seems to me that the first thing one has to do when you study the Prophet, and many people don't do it, it's the same thing that you have to do when you study Islam. First question you want to ask yourself in research is, how have Muslims understood the Prophet? How do they understand the Prophet? If one understands the way in which Muslims understand the Prophet, then it certainly makes one very careful if one wants to be very quick to project and say, well, the Prophet Muhammad was violent, excessively violent. The Prophet Muhammad was corrupt or whatever. Because one would simply say, look at the incredible role the Prophet has played, his sunnah, as the model for this community. There's something special here. There's something about this person. And I think that one sees this. I mean, I think that I think the Prophet is taken much more seriously. I think the role of the Prophet. I think that certainly from an academic point of view, one sees more and more scholars who study the Prophet and talk about the Prophet and explain the Prophet within an Islamic context, the same way they would do and look at Jesus within a Christian context, or Moses within a Jewish context. So it's in a way, it's almost polar opposites that you see.
Won't you agree with me? I feel that in Western scholarship, there has been a methodological problem. In the West, since the development of the demethodologization school, Rudolf Bultmann came up with his critique on Christianity. Earlier, we find same phenomena with Judaism. Then we find search for historical Jesus. There is a gradual development in Christian world about the personality of Sayyidina Isa alayhi salatu wassalam. Perhaps a similar approach, a model developed for Christianity, was superimposed on the personality of the Prophet. And all those questions were raised about him, which were earlier explored by the Christian scholars with reference to the historic presence of Jesus.
I think that the tendency of some scholars, both with regard to the Prophet as well as with regard to the Quran, is to presume that a very similar process has to take place. And I think that's a problem. I think certainly there are ways in which there can be a more critical understanding both of the Prophet and of the Quran. But the presumption that what happens in one faith happens in the other simply is not true. Even if we compare, for example, if we look at the Bible, while biblical criticism has occurred both with regard to the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, yet the levels of history are far different. The amount of recognition of massive editing is far different. And so I think also one has to be open to the fact that when one when it talks about the Quran and when it talks about the life of the Prophet, that while there may be some occasional similarities, A, you can't presume a similarity, and B, they are no way necessarily identical. And I think that that's the most important thing.
Do you think the overall understanding of the Western mind that a prophet has to be somewhat divine, while Islam insists that Prophet, peace be upon him, is essentially the perfect human model who receives divine revelation? Now that perhaps has some kind of problem for the Western mind, which claims that unless you have a totally divine person, as they assume Sayyidina Isa is, they find certain shortcomings, they find discrepancies, they think it's less than the ideal which deserves obedience by followers.
I think it comes from two perspectives. I think that's one of them. I think that, for example, for certain kind of evangelical, conservative, what some call fundamentalist Christians, that would be exactly the approach that would be taken. And so they would make the judgment from saying, first of all, that Jesus is divine, and that therefore they would begin by saying it's impossible for a Muhammad to be a prophet or to be the kind of model that he is. But I think the other side, and I think the other side is even more pervasive, is the much more secular mentality. Mm-hmm. You know, the very, very secular mentality is incapable of appreciating the role that the prophet plays. The very secular mentality tends to pull down all prophets, tends to bring them down to, people bring them down to, as I would put it, their size, their dimension. They cannot accept the role of great prophets like Muhammad and Jesus or Moses.
Toynbee, in his book on history, mentions very clearly that the Prophet, peace be upon him, when he migrated from Mecca to Medina, then he changed the job of a prophet to a statesman. If I recall correctly, what he said was that instead of being crucified and glorified for all ages to come, he became a very mundane person. Do you think that kind of analysis still continues in the Western mind, or it's passé?
I think that it's passing, but I think that for some there's still that mentality, especially for those who have a problem with the idea that the prophet or religion can relate as much as Islam does to everyday reality. So in a sense, for these people, they immediately distinguish between, very narrowly, between religion and then the mundane world. And when they see a crossover, they say that's impossible. It can't be religion. Or if the other thing they say is, because it's impossible, if it does occur, it's dangerous, it's retrogressive, it's backward. And I think that that also is part of the mentality. There's a fear of that level of involvement. On the other hand, I think that that's changing, because what people forget is we're in the middle of a global religious resurgence. Across the world, we see a religious resurgence. And so I think that that's also going to, I think, change the situation more and more. It's not only in the Muslim world, it's in many societies. We see what I would call a much stronger alternative elite, an elite that is modern educated, but more religiously oriented.
Thank you, John. I think we have discussed various aspects of the life of the Prophet and how today, on the threshold of 21st century, we find the Western scholars, we find Western thinking changing toward the life of the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him. Thank you again for your kind consent to have some views from you on the life of the Prophet.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.